In the quiet halls of St. Matthew's Hospital, it echoed like an alarm. Nurses passed each other with weary looks, doctors exchanged puzzled frowns, and still the sound went on. It wasn't the cry of a hungry baby, nor the soft whimper of a newborn seeking comfort. It was raw, urgent, unending, a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of the child's tiny being. Inside the private room at the end of the corridor, Catherine Monroe sat with her head in her hands. Her arms ached from rocking, her throat burned from singing, and her heart broke from helplessness. Her son, only 2 days old, screamed in her arms as though the world had wronged him already. Richard Monroe stood near the crib, his tie undone, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Known to the world as a millionaire developer with a steel grip on power and success, Richard now looked like any other father undone by something money could not touch. He had weathered hostile takeovers and brutal negotiations, but he could not withstand the sound of his son crying without end. "Why won't he stop?" Catherine whispered, voice cracking as she rocked the baby harder. "Why can't he rest, even for a moment? Doctors had tested everything. His vitals were strong. No fever. No colic. No hidden illness. By every measure, the infant was healthy. Nurses had tried every trick they knew, adjusting the swaddle, warming the room, checking his tiny lungs, coaxing him with milk. Nothing worked. Still he wailed, his face red, his fists trembling, his body stiff with an agony no one could name. Richard rubbed his face with both hands, muttering, "There has to be an explanation. There always is." But his voice carried less conviction than he intended. Catherine turned to him, her eyes glassy. "I can't do this anymore. I don't know what else to try. I don't know what he wants." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that they'd figure it out, but the words felt hollow. He had never been a man who lacked answers. Yet tonight, standing in this sterile room, he had none. Word of the inconsolable child spread through the hospital. Orderlies whispered about the millionaire's baby who couldn't be soothed. Some dismissed it as nerves, others said the boy simply had strong lungs. But beneath the chatter was unease, as though everyone felt something deeper was at work. Near midnight, when Catherine finally slumped into sleep in a chair, Richard remained awake, pacing. His son's cries rattled him in ways he could not explain. He whispered desperately, "Please, son, please stop." But his pleas dissolved into the air unanswered. A soft knock came at the door. A nurse stepped inside, her expression hesitant. "Mr. Monroe," she said carefully, "there's someone here. She isn't medical staff, but families sometimes ask for her when nothing else works. Would you like me to bring her?" Richard frowned. "Who is she?" The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "She works in the building. She's been here a long time. Some say she has a way with babies, especially those who won't be calmed." Richard hesitated. The idea felt absurd. He had access to the best doctors money could buy, yet the solution was a woman from the cleaning staff. His pride flared, but another piercing cry ripped through the room, and his pride collapsed under the weight of his desperation. "Bring her," he said, his voice rough. Moments later, the door opened again. An older woman stepped inside. Her uniform was plain, her hair streaked with gray, tied back neatly. Her face was lined, not from cruelty but from years of carrying quiet burdens. Most striking of all were her eyes, calm, knowing, unhurried, as though she had seen storms like this before and never been swept away. She did not ask permission. She simply walked to the crib, moving with the kind of patience born from years of listening more than speaking. She leaned close, studying the child whose cries shook the walls. Then she hummed. A low, steady sound, more vibration than song, something that seemed to come from deep within her chest. The baby's wail wavered, just for a second. His tiny fists loosened slightly. The woman whispered a few words, so soft they seemed meant only for him. Richard froze. Catherine stirred awake, blinking in disbelief as she saw the stranger holding her son. At first, the cries spiked louder, as though the baby resisted. But then, almost suddenly, they ceased. His body relaxed. His face softened. And for the first time in 2 days, silence filled the room. Catherine gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears welled as she whispered, he's quiet." Richard stared, his heart pounding, as the woman turned toward him. Her gaze was steady, her voice soft but firm. "He cries because he feels what you do not speak," she said. "He carries what you try to hide." The word struck him like a blow. His face paled, his breath caught. For behind all the walls of wealth and control, there was a truth he had buried so deep he thought it gone forever. And somehow, this woman had seen it. The silence was almost unbearable after so much noise. It pressed into Richard's chest, heavy and strange, as he stared at his son now resting quietly against the older woman's shoulder. For 2 days the baby had howled without pause, and now, in the arms of a stranger, he breathed evenly, eyelids fluttering in sleep. Richard's pride battled with awe. He wanted to demand answers, to assert control over the scene. Yet his voice caught in his throat, and what came out instead was a hoarse whisper. "What did you say to him?" The woman's eyes lifted, calm and unwavering. "I told him what you never have. He needed to hear it, and so did you." Richard blinked. His jaw tightened. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" She did not flinch at his sharpness. She rocked the baby gently, the chair creaking in rhythm. "Babies feel more than we understand. They know when love is steady, and they know when fear lingers in a room. He cries because he feels what you bury." Catherine had risen from the chair, her exhaustion forgotten. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders and asked, her voice trembling, "What is he feeling? What is it that we're hiding from him?" The woman glanced at Catherine with compassion before turning her gaze back to Richard. "This isn't about her. It's about you." The word struck like a hammer. Richard's defenses flared. He had built a life on control, on never letting anyone see the cracks. His empire was his armor. But now, with his son lying still at last, he could not deny that this woman, this quiet, ordinary worker, had done what no one else could. "I've given him everything," Richard said, his voice breaking with frustration. "Money. Safety. A future. What more could a child want?" "None of those things matter tonight," she replied softly. "What he wanted was to hear that you will not leave him. What he needed was to feel that you are not the man you fear becoming." Richard's face went pale. Catherine turned sharply to him, confusion and worry in her eyes. "Richard, what is she talking about?" He turned away, his hand pressed against the window as the city lights blurred beneath him. The truth rose like bile in his throat, a truth he had buried since boyhood. For a moment, he thought he could swallow it down again. But then he heard his son stir, a tiny whimper beginning to form, and he knew he couldn't. "My father," Richard began, his voice shaking. "When I cried as a child, he wouldn't touch me. Wouldn't comfort me. He'd stand in the doorway and say, 'Let him cry it out. Toughens him up.' My mother, she tried, but he'd stop her. He said men had to be hard. That softness was weakness." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she moved toward him. "Richard." He shook his head. "I swore I'd be different. That I'd never treat my child that way. But when our son cries, it feels like I'm back there, trapped in that house, waiting for comfort that never came. And then I freeze. Or I run. I took a call during the birth because I didn't know how to face him." His hand trembled against the glass. "God help me, I was scared of my own child." The confession tore through him. His chest ached with the weight of it, but strangely, some of the air returned to his lungs. He turned to see the woman's steady gaze fixed on him. "There it is," she said quietly. "The sound your son has been waiting to hear. Not the money, not the promises, not the silence. The truth." Catherine pressed her hands to her mouth, sobbing softly, not out of despair but recognition. She had known something unspoken lived inside her husband, but she had never guessed it ran so deep. Richard's legs weakened, and he sank into the chair beside the crib. The woman stood and moved closer, holding out the baby toward him. "Now take him," she said. "He doesn't just need my voice. He needs yours." Richard hesitated. Fear clawed at him again. "What if he starts crying?" "Then you'll hold him anyway," she answered. "And this time, you won't turn away." His hands shook as he reached out. The baby was warm, so small yet impossibly heavy with meaning. He nestled against Richard's chest, shifting, threatening to wake. Richard bent close, his lips near his son's ear. The words caught at first, thick in his throat. But then, raw and unpolished, they came out. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I don't know what I'm doing. But I'm not leaving. Not ever. You hear me? I'm staying." The baby stirred, let out a tiny sigh, then settled again. No screams. No storm. Just the soft sound of breathing, steady and sure. Richard's tears fell freely, dampening his son's blanket. Catherine knelt beside him, her hand gripping his arm, her face alight with both sorrow and relief. The woman watched them silently, then spoke once more. "That's all he needed. Not perfection. Not power. Just your truth." Richard pressed his cheek against the soft crown of his son's head. For the first time since the birth, he allowed himself to weep, not as a businessman, not as a provider, but simply as a father who had finally spoken aloud what he had always feared. The baby slept on, his cries silenced not by wealth or medicine, but by words spoken from the heart. Morning light spilled through the blinds, drawing pale stripes across the hospital floor. The baby slept in Richard's arms, his tiny body curled against his father's chest as though he had always belonged there. The cries that had tormented the ward for 2 days were gone, replaced by quiet breaths and occasional soft noises that sounded almost like contentment. Catherine hovered nearby, exhausted but unable to stop staring. Her heart swelled at the sight of her husband holding their son with such tenderness. It was a picture she had dreamed of, but until this moment, she hadn't believed it could happen. The older woman sat by the window, watching without intruding. She seemed at ease, as though she had seen this scene unfold many times before. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, almost like a prayer. "He needed your truth. That's why he cried so hard. He was waiting to know that his father would not repeat the silence of the past." Richard's eyes stayed fixed on his son. His voice was quiet, heavy with both wonder and shame. "I almost let him inherit my fear before he learned my name. I almost gave him the same emptiness I grew up with." Catherine moved closer, resting her hand on his shoulder. "But you didn't. You're here now. That's what matters." The woman nodded. "He will cry again. That's what babies do. But now you understand. When he does, don't hear only the noise. Hear the question inside it. And answer with your presence." Richard looked at her, torn between gratitude and disbelief. "How did you know? How could you possibly see something I've hidden all my life?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes the smallest hearts tell the loudest truths. Your son was trying to tell you what you already knew but refused to face." Her words sank into him. He thought of board meetings where he had commanded entire rooms, of contracts that shaped skylines. None of it had stripped him bare like this. He realized, with startling clarity, that all his wealth and power had been walls, walls built to keep others from seeing what lay behind them. But his son, with nothing but a cry, had torn those walls down in 2 days. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes red from tears but brighter than before. I always knew there was something in you you kept locked away. I felt it even when we were dating. I thought maybe time would soften it. But now I see, it wasn't time you needed. It was him. She gestured toward their sleeping child. Richard swallowed hard. I don't want to fail him. Or you. Then don't, she said simply. We don't need perfection, Richard. We need honesty. We need you. The baby stirred, letting out a small grunt, and Richard instinctively adjusted him, patting his tiny back until he settled again. The movement felt natural, something he would have fumbled with only hours before. Catherine noticed and smiled through her tears. The woman by the window rose, smoothing her uniform as though preparing to leave. You have what you need now, she said quietly. The rest is practice. Don't forget what you whispered. Say it again when the fear returns. Say it until your voice becomes the shelter he knows by heart. Richard looked up sharply. Wait. Tell me exactly what you whispered to him. What words made him stop crying? For the first time, the woman's eyes softened into something like a smile. I told him that his father would not leave. That his mother would not carry the weight alone. And that when he cried, someone would always come. The words landed heavy and holy in the room. Catherine's breath hitched, her hand tightening around Richard's. He looked down at his son, then back at the woman, his voice breaking. Those words should have been mine. They still can be, she said. Say them often. Let him grow up never doubting them. Richard lowered his face to his son's head and whispered again, barely louder than a breath, I'm not leaving. You won't be alone. When you cry, I will come. The baby shifted but did not wake, his body trusting, his breath steady. Catherine pressed her forehead to Richard's shoulder, her tears warm against his skin. For the first time since labor began, she felt like they were no longer drowning. They were learning to swim together. The woman gathered her things slowly, her steps unhurried. At the door, she paused and looked back once more. The hardest battles aren't fought in boardrooms, she said softly. They're fought in hearts. Win there, and you'll never fear losing anywhere else. She left without ceremony, her figure disappearing into the hum of the hospital. Richard sat motionless, the baby warm against him, Catherine leaning into his side. He felt raw, unsteady, but also anchored in a way he had never known. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the empire waiting for him outside these walls. He was thinking only of the small heartbeat pressed against his chest, and the promise he had finally spoken aloud. The day moved on around them, nurses coming and going, monitors beeping softly, the world spinning as it always did. But inside that room, time seemed to slow, holding the family in a fragile, sacred pause before what would come next. The wail started in the small hours, a blade cutting through St. Matthew's Hospital. Nurses traded glances, monitors blinked green, and the baby in room 517 refused mercy. He didn't whimper, he raged, tiny chest heaving, fists clenching, face flushed red. Richard Monroe stood at the crib, a man who could quiet a boardroom. None of that mattered. Beside him, his wife Catherine rocked in a chair, blonde hair damp, whispering songs she'd learned as a child in Indiana. Milk, blankets, new swaddles, skin to skin, everything failed. The child howled as if the world had arrived already broken. Doctors came with gentle hands and practiced certainty. Vitals strong. Lungs clear. No fever. A healthy boy, they said. Nurses soothed, adjusted, measured. The crying clawed through their efforts. Why won't he stop? Catherine asked, voice shredded by a sleepless night. Richard had answers for everything except this. There's a reason, he said, as if logic could bargain with a newborn. There has to be. By midnight of the second day, Catherine drifted into a shallow doze. Richard stayed upright, jaw tight, heart drumming. A knock touched the door. A nurse stepped in, hesitant. "Sir," she said softly, "there's a woman who's been here a long time. Families ask for her when nothing works." She shifted. "She isn't medical staff." Richard's pride lifted its head, then the baby's cry shattered it. "Bring her," he said. The woman entered without hurry, a figure in a plain uniform, hair streaked with gray, posture steady. She didn't reach for machines or charts. She stood by the crib and listened, as if the sound carried a language everyone else had forgotten. She hummed. Not a song Richard knew, just a low tone that seemed to warm the air. The baby's fists loosened. The cry dipped, tried to rise. The woman lifted him, slow and sure. Catherine startled awake, too tired to protest. At first the howl sharpened. Then the woman leaned close and spoke a single sentence, soft enough to belong only to the child. Silence fell. Real silence, the kind that makes you hear your own blood. The baby's face unknotted. His breathing found a gentler rhythm. Catherine choked on relief. "Oh, God," she whispered. "He's quiet." Richard stared. "What did you say to him?" The woman met his eyes, calm as a winter lake. "What you've never said out loud." He went pale, as if someone had opened a drain inside him. He felt 14 again, standing in a hallway while a man's voice dismissed his tears as weakness. He felt the promise he'd made himself, kept like a coin in a shoe, "I will be different." The woman rocked. "He feels what you hide," she said. "He cries the truth you won't speak." Richard looked at his son, at the small mouth soft with sleep, and realized the richest thing in the room was the sentence he'd never learned to say. "Teach me," he said. "Hold him," the woman answered. "And start with the truth." He slid his arms beneath the child, breath unsteady, ready to try the words tonight himself.